Heinleiners! Yep, you heard that correct. We grok you, and I've got my water brother, Mark Conlan, here to talk about Stranger in a Strange Land. Mark, can you introduce yourself to the folks out there in Dickheads Land?
Okay, Mark Gabrish Conlan, fan of science fiction and mysteries and old movies and quite a lot of music. My tastes run from opera to a lot of the early punk and everything in between.
Yeah, and I know Mark from back in the day. Used to do a self-published political journal called Zangers. So, just was really important to our community for a long time. So, you may remember Mark from our Journal of the Plague Years Spin Ratters special. And so he's as much of a nerd for all things science fiction and literature as we are, so we're very glad to have him back here for Stranger in a Strange Land. So, on that note, this is a continuing bonus episode in our Hugo Award winning series from the 60s, which we kicked off by doing Starship Troopers with our April Fool's Day Heinleiners.
Hey, David?
Yeah.
Can you say Hugo Award winners of the 1960s?
Oh, sorry. The Hugo Award winners for Best Novel from the 1960s. There you go. So, Stranger in a Strange Land was the winner in 1962, 2 years after Heinlein won for Starship Troopers. So, this was this is the second of 3 books that Heinlein won the big prize for in the 60s, and the third was Moon is a Harsh Mistress, which we'll be recording later. But tonight, we're going to talk about Stranger in a Strange Land, which came out in 1961. Mark, what was happening in the world in 1961?
Well, it was the year that President John F. Kennedy was inaugurated and promptly got himself into a foreign policy disaster with the CIA's attempted invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, which disillusioned a lot of people who had thought he represented something fundamentally different from the presidents of the past. It was also the year the Berlin Wall went up. It was the year when the music charts were dominated by Chubby Checker and the Twist, though that might have been a year later. I'm not sure. And it was actually a pretty trivial era in pop music, and
yeah, I'm not sure what we were doing in movies around that time, but but I think this is really good context, and I always like to talk about what was going on in the world because I think once we get into the social political themes of this novel, it's really interesting to think about what the world was like in 1961.
Certainly the number one movie of that year was West Side Story, and it was the Academy Award winner the year Stranger in a Strange Land was the Hugo winner.
Ah, off the top of your head. Good job, Mark. West Side Story, which is soon to be remade by Steven Spielberg. I don't know if you... I don't want to get into Spielcast, which we... for some reason, we always end up talking about Steven Spielberg on Dickheads.
As long as the leads can sing, I'll be okay with it.
Yeah, I don't know that. I don't know anything about that. I'm not a musical guy, so I don't know what to make of that. But let's talk about the writing and publication history of Stranger in a Strange Land, which, as you noted before we started recording, for a guy who considers himself agnostic, this is one of 2 titles that have biblical reference, right? And I believe the other one was Job.
I was thinking of I Will Fear No Evil.
So we got 3, at least, because Job was kind of... that's definitely a biblical reference, but Fear No Evil is another one. So yeah, But the original title, by the way, that the working title that he went with was The Heretic. However, he did play around with the name A Martian Named Smith and The Man from Mars. I don't know about you guys, but I think Stranger in a Strange Land is definitely the best title of those. The Heretic, I know it does explain what's going on, but I don't think it's a great title, and A Martian Named Smith is a little on the nose. But I don't know. How do you feel about the title, Mark?
Well, I think it's a great title. It's, expressive of the fact that the central character is alienated from his Earth origins, but he's also alienating the Earth people who are trying to work with him and teach him how we live on this planet.
Yeah, and he was also born a stranger on Mars because he's we'll get into more of the plot stuff in a little bit. Now, specifically, Heinlein got the idea over 10 years before he ended up writing. I believe 1948 is when as the story goes, that he and his wife Virginia were brainstorming different ideas because, I'm sure they were trying to think, we got to make some money here around this house. Like, what can you come up with, Robert? And she suggested that they do a sci-fi version of Kipling's The Jungle Book, which obviously was from the century before. And although popularized by a Disney movie, it was, of course, a beloved book. And I think the idea was to write a story about a human child raised by aliens, specifically Martians, which is funny because the novel that we end up with doesn't really... That is a part of the story, but it is not the story.
In fact, Stranger in a Strange Land basically begins where the Jungle Book ends, with the central character's reintroduction to human society. And I remember my husband Charles saying that he thought there was a strong parallel between Stranger in a Strange Land and the first Edgar Rice Burroughs Tarzan. And
he ends up going back to civilization,
and Burroughs may have been ripping off Kipling as well. And but the idea goes back to the founding legend of Rome, with Romulus and Remus being raised by wolves, and probably even farther than that.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I'm sure there's probably all kinds of different literary influences that are throughout this, and I'm sure when we start discussing the story, we'll see more of those. I hadn't thought about the Romulus and Remus one, but it's really good. Of course, when I think of Romulus and Remus in my generation, I think of the G.I. Joe characters. But I'm showing my age right there. Anyways, at the publisher's request, he turned it in at a very thick length, and about 60,000 words, 25% of the book was chopped out. Now, however, this is going to make... One interesting thing about the way we're doing this podcast is that we both bought the book at the same bookstore, used bookstore in San Diego. Shout out to Verbatim Books and Justine, who just recently expanded, and the bookstore looks amazing. And there are two versions there. There was the 1969 mass market paperback shortened version, which I bought, and then a couple days later, Mark swooped in and bought the unabridged, much thicker version of Stranger in a Strange Land that was released in 1991, uncut. So that's about 60,000 words were removed between the version Mark read and the version that I read. So they're going to be slightly different takes, but I think mostly Heinlein said that the story didn't change much. It was mostly a lot of verbose language and so on and so forth. Is what most of the research I've done is, but I've only read the short version. So.
And Heinlein left contradictory messages as to which version he preferred.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Because there's times where he definitely, and how about that? Heinlein being contradictory. I can't imagine that. All these sci-fi guys from that era, I don't know that there's anybody who is like super, super consistent. Like, I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe Clark. Maybe Asimov. I don't know. I don't know if I'd go that far. But anyways, so the critics disagree a little bit too on which version is preferred. I think most people consider the shorter version to be the superior edit. However, there's definitely split opinions on that.
I've heard contradictory signals from my friends. One person who actually read both of them about 20 years ago said that he thought that the original version was simply a first draft, and that even if Heinlein hadn't been forced by his publisher to cut it that radically, he would still have made a lot of revisions before he submitted it for publication.
Well, that's interesting because I do have a quote from Heinlein here. And he says, Stranger in a Strange Land was never censored by anyone in any fashion. The first draft was nearly twice as long as the published version. I cut it myself to bring it down to commercial length. But I did not leave out anything of any importance. I simply trimmed the possible excess verbiage. Perhaps you've noticed that it reads fast despite its length. That is why. The original longest version of Stranger in a Strange Land is not really worth your trouble, as it is the same story throughout, simply not told as well. And then he goes on to say some other things, but I think that's basically the key there. So yeah, he definitely, and I know there was other times where there was another quote where he said that he described it as being telegraphese.
Yeah, that was the quote that his wife put in the preface to the long version, justifying her decision to publish it.
Right.
So he might have told her one thing and then told the friend that he wrote the letter you were quoting to a decade later, told him something else.
Right, and that was a letter to his literary agent, Lurton Blasingame, which is a great name. Lurton? I've never heard of anyone named Lurton. That's a Philip K. Dick character name. But he said, in that letter, he said, if I cut out religion and sex, I'm very much afraid that I will end up with a non-alcoholic martini. He continued to say in the letter...
Well, if you cut out religion and sex from Stranger in a Strange Land, you'd end up with a short story.
Yeah, or you'd end up with something that was pretty pointless. There's not much going on there. So the story is supposed to be completely this is what he said. Heinlein continued. The story is supposed to be a completely freewheeling look at contemporary human culture from the non-human viewpoint of the man on Mars in the sense of the philosophical cliche. No sacred cows of any sort. In addition to a double dozen of minor satirical slants, the two major things which I am attacking are the biggest, fattest sacred cows of all. Two that every writer is supposed to give at least lip service to, the illicit assumptions of our Western culture concerning religion and sex. So, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. This idea that the novel is attacking sacred cows, I would say that is definitely a huge part of why it became like kind of this cult phenomenon, is because I think the novel, well, put it in the context of 1961 or 1960 when he's writing it. I mean, this is way early to be making those kinds of points and messages, and where it might seem quaint 60 years later, or however long, or 50 years, 60 years later, but it was pretty hardcore at the time to question these things. I don't know, was there any? I can't think of anything that was in mass media at the time that was really dealing with these issues, right? Nothing that had been a bestseller for sure.
Yeah, it was an interesting thing, it was, for one thing, it was Robert Heinlein's attempt, after he had built up a reputation for short stories and what would now be called young adult novels, to present himself on a larger canvas, as it were, and to say, I am a writer, I am a literateur, I have serious things to say that I can't just get into a pulp story or a YA novel.
Yeah, and I've seen some assertions that Heinlein was being revolutionary by putting sex into science fiction, but he was not the first. I think a lot of people give that attention to Philip Jose Farmer for his novel The Lovers, right? As being like kind of the first like hardcore sex sci-fi novel. And then a couple years later, you're going to have the new wave. You're going to have your John Bruners, your Philip K. Dick, your Le Guins that are really going to like break it all open with books like Dangerous Visions and stuff like that. So, I mean, he was early in this, but I wouldn't say he was the first.
And it was a change in the overall culture that,
sure.
Mainstream novels were coming out. Lady Chatterley's Lover was published in 1959, 31 years after it was written.
Mm-hmm.
You had the controversies over Lolita. You had a lot of, non-genre books that were also breaking down some of the sexual barriers and
In fiction in general.
And also the pushback against the production code in movies, the fact that audiences in America were developing a taste for foreign films. Fellini's La Dolce Vita was a box office hit in 1960, and it was a movie that introduced a lot of U.S. audiences to the greater freedom that foreign filmmakers, not bound by the production code, had to deal with sex.
Right, and so I'm not downplaying that Stranger in Strangeland was doing revolutionary things with the form in science fiction, because I believe that he was, and it's a masterpiece for a reason, or considered a masterpiece for a reason. And I think that a lot of the ways that it broke these barriers were really important. So even if it was happening in other genres and mass literature, I still think it's important that Heinlein was doing it here. But I think also what you were saying about the fact that he had a reputation for writing these juvenile novels, like Have Spaceship Will Travel and a lot of the
and the Rolling Stones, which I have a particular affection for because the Martian Flat Cats were the source of the Tribbles.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
And actually, David Gerrold, the author of The Trouble with Tribbles, admitted it. Yeah, I got it from Robert Heinlein and the Martian Flat Cats.
Yeah, which is interesting. Yeah, I mean, and he had, you were definitely right. He had wanted to break away from the YA stuff, and he was working on Stranger in a Strangeland before he wrote Starship Troopers, which is kind of an interesting thing, because I do remember when we did our Starship Troopers episode, he had started Stranger in a Strangeland, and then he had the whole instance where he saw the anti-nuclear ad that pissed him off enough to go and write Starship Troopers. So he halted Stranger in a Strangeland to write Starship Troopers, which, as much as we talked about it earlier, that it's interesting that he followed up the publication of Starship Troopers, he really wrote Starship Troopers in the middle of writing Stranger in a Strangeland. Now, wrap your head around that politically.
Although, it did occur to me when I got to the end of Stranger in a Strangeland and read the trick ending that he supplied, that one could readily imagine a Stranger in a Strangeland sequel in which the Earth has to organize a Starship Troopers-like force to prevent itself from being destroyed by Mars.
Being turned into another asteroid belt.
Yeah.
Right. And, spoilers. I mean, we assume you've read the book or don't care about spoilers at this point. Here's one thing that's really interesting. Now, you were talking about, like, the proof about the whole thing that he wanted to be a serious writer, was that I saw a quote where he didn't, well, it's like that whole thing, like, we see in punk rock all the time that people are like, oh, this is my serious rock record, I'm no longer a punk rocker, or whatever. And you definitely see filmmakers doing this. Heinlein did that with Stranger in Strangeland. There were times where he referred to it as not being science fiction at all. And he referred to it as, quote, a socio-political satire of sex and religion in contemporary culture. Try putting that on the spine of a book. I mean, I get it. It is a socio-political satire of sex and religion in contemporary culture, but it's also a science fiction novel. Because, I'm sorry, my dude, you got Martians in it, and you got people traveling back and forth between here and Mars. It's a science fiction novel. So, and you got psychic people, and you got like all kinds of other stuff going on.
And you've got spaceships going back and forth. You've got this book coming out the year that people are finally getting into space.
Right. And just in the same way, I would say, most of the books that some people say are not science fiction by Kurt Vonnegut are definitely science fiction. Slaughterhouse-Five is science fiction. Cat's Cradle is science fiction. And definitely Sirens of Titan, all those, they're science fiction. And in this case, too, Heinlein can put all these lofty things on top of it, but in the end, Stranger in Strangeland is a science fiction novel.
And certainly people had been writing science fiction social commentary, at least since H.G. Wells, arguably since Jonathan Swift.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's the whole history of it. I mean, and that's the thing is there's very little science fiction that can't in some way be considered social commentary at all. Like, all of it. Especially in the early days, too, when you've got even Frankenstein is social commentary, right? Mm-hmm. So, and a lot of people consider that to be like one of the first, like, real true science fiction novels.
Yes, I've had that argument with some friends, saying, well, who's the first important woman science fiction writer? Well, of course, it's Mary Shelley, duh.
Yeah. Oh, it absolutely is. And so, the history of social commentary there it's always been there. It's always been a part of it. And Heinlein needs, I get it. I get why he wants to kind of distance himself from that, but it's fucking science fiction,
And one of the things about Stranger in a Strange Land that struck me, it was, it's been one of those books that I never got around to reading until David asked me to do this podcast, and discovering that there was a longer version, and that was the copy available to me, put an interesting spin on it, because one of the weaknesses, and maybe this was the main source of the cuts, is just how often Heinlein gets on his soapbox. The character of Jubal Kershaw is obviously Heinlein's avatar in the book. Mm-hmm. But the lectures don't just come from him. They come from all sorts of other characters. And as the thing went on, I was having to look back saying, okay, which character is delivering Heinlein's diatribe now?
Right. Which, is a thing that... I guess, there's diatribes in Starship Troopers, which is a super thin book, but, he did it in a very kind of sly and very thin way, although I'm not going to say that Starship Troopers was sly, because the points, he made the points with a hammer to your face, but... we'll get more into the impact of the story. Let's talk about the impact of this novel for a little bit, and then we'll start reviewing the story and talk more about the actual story. In 2012, the U.S. Library of Congress named it one of 88 books that shaped America. That's pretty high praise for any book, let alone a science fiction book. I'm not sure how many science fiction books are on that list entirely, but I doubt there's many. I bet there's probably some Vonnegut, maybe a Slaughterhouse-Five on there. I didn't look at the whole list, but I think that's a really great honor, and it says something about Stranger in a Strange Land. I also, the fact that it was nominated for the Hugo, we'll get back to that in a little bit. We'll look at some of the other things that were nominated in that year. But it was also the first science fiction novel to make it to the New York Times bestseller list, which
means it was reaching an audience beyond the science fiction fan group.
Right. And one of the interesting things that happened with this book is that a St. Louis native named Timothy Zell created the Church of All Worlds, adopting the whole belief system of this book, and made a real neo-pagan church, legally recognized here in the state of California, which he says is used to promote philosophical tolerance, polygamy, the tenets of both socialism and libertarianism. And just for the record, Heinlein never joined the Church of All Worlds.
I would have been quite surprised if he had.
Right. So, I don't think it's ever as successful as L. Ron Hubbard's religious leanings. Yes, but as
talk about a contemporary of Heinlein's who started out as a pulp writer
and then turned to creating a religion. But he actually did it himself.
Yes, and who the scriptures of Scientology, the works that Hubbard wrote as the scriptures of Scientology bear an interesting and striking resemblance to the works he offered in the commercial marketplace as science fiction.
Right. And so it's funny because, because these guys were contemporaries and Hubbard and Heinlein were friends. And so there's lots of really good stories in the book Astounding that came out this last year.
And there is a brief mention of Scientology in Stranger.
That's right. And so it's not that they're ignoring this, because it's definitely there in this book. But what I guess I want to say about, it's goofy that there's this real life, allegedly, religion. I don't know how serious anyone really takes it. But this book had a huge cultural impact, because people, not only did the Webster's Dictionary added a word to the dictionary with grok, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a word was created. Not only that, but a lot of people were using this as a basis of their kind of like free love kind of ideals. But I don't know how much of that is on Heinlein, or it was just in the zeitgeist at the time. I wasn't alive in the 60s, so, I wasn't born until 1974, so I don't remember this stuff. But from what I've read, it just kind of seems like it was zeitgeist more than it was influence, but I don't know. I don't know what you think.
I was alive in the 60s, and I think it was a book that a lot of people who considered themselves hippies seized on as, sort of a way station on what they were working out. And it's really the book of the Stranger in a Strange Land's philosophy is really very much a man's version of sexual liberation. That in the late 60s, the people who thought they were rejecting the straight, back when that meant unhip and not ungay, community and its sexual values, were creating a value system that objectified women just as much as the straight world did. And
there's a shit ton of misogyny in this book.
I mean, one of the things that struck me is that just when I would think that Heinlein was actually creating a powerful woman character with agency of her own, he would throw in some nasty little sexist crack about her, or give her a vulnerability that kind of tapped you on the shoulder and say, this is still a man of his time with, all the vices inherent there too, including how he felt about women.
And there's straight up a line in there where he talks about women being responsible or to blame for why they were raped. Is in this text. It's like you cannot not notice it. I mean, it's like the record scratch when you're reading, which was one of the most awful parts, or one of the hardest parts of the book for me. But there's a lot of misogyny in this book.
At one point, he actually sounds like that Republican congressman who said that women couldn't get pregnant from rape because their bodies had a way of shutting it down.
Right. And I think that's one of the hardest things about this book for me is this, we'll get more into that later when we get more into the book. Let's continue to talk about the impact. Here's the funny thing for me. Okay. This is hilarious. Okay, back to a funny note, since we got all depressing for a second. You talked about the fact that hippies glommed onto this book. That had to annoy the shit out of Heinlein, because here's a guy who just finished winning, or just won an award 2 years earlier for a book that was his big middle finger to the anti-war, the anti-nuke, hippie people. And then he writes a book that they're all about 2 years later. And that shows you just the whole confusing thing about what is Heinlein thinking? Is he a right winger? Is he, I know he considered himself a libertarian, right? But there's right wing libertarians. Robert A. Heinlein, is a prime example. And I think that's why you have this book that can be, you have 2 years separated, you have a book that could be a total yay, rah, right wing. And then you have this book that hippies would be like, dude, Stranger in Strangeland, I grok you, man. It's just such a weird dichotomy that just 2 years separating. And the fact that we know, just because we from the research that he wrote half of Stranger in a Strange Land, wrote Starship Troopers, and came back to it.
So that it
It's
was
like-
basically, he was writing it at the same time.
Yeah. That's
And
super fucking weird.
it's one of the things, that kind of put me off of trying to crack Heinlein's big novels because, I've been appalled by the politics of his short stories and his short novels.
Mhm.
And it's like, okay, Starship Troopers reminds me of a remark my mom made when the film Patton came out, that she was a heavy-duty anti-war, civil rights activist, but she said, well, if we were ever invaded by an alien race from another planet, I'd want a guy like Patton leading the army. And that's basically the message of Starship Troopers. We need guys like Patton because aliens are going to invade and we need to defend ourselves.
Well, right. Well, and his original inspiration for writing Starship Troopers was that he saw a billboard, right, that was anti-nuclear weapons, and he was horrified. And so he went and he's like, I'm going to show them pacifists a thing or two. And he gave a speech at the Naval Academy like years later that was like dripping with, this crypto-fascist, like super pro-military thing, to which, if you go back and listen to our Starship Troopers episode, you can hear Anthony like basically blow his top about it. Because here's the thing, and I agree with him, like I didn't like the politics of that, but one of the things that was funny is because with Starship Troopers, I was able to kind of separate what I disagreed and said, I think this is a really good science fiction novel, even though I don't agree with it. But here's my problem with Starship Troopers, and I may be getting ahead of myself a little bit. With Stranger in Strangeland, is that I'm not sure there's a good science fiction novel here. And I'm not sure what to feel about like what he's saying in it either. And I guess that's kind of the segue to talking about what happens in the story. So let's talk about what happens in the story.
Because that was one of the things that struck me, is that compared to the Jungle Book, which he cited as his inspiration, we really get nothing about what Valentine Michael Smith's life was like on Mars.
Now, that I actually liked. Now, it's interesting because I'm not sure if everyone who read this book is going to enjoy that, but I liked the mystery of the fact that we didn't know a lot about the Martians. Now, you're right, that makes it totally different from Jungle Book, which was their inspiration, but I like that the Martians are mysterious, that we don't know what they are, that they are this kind of like weird, crazy other, and I think that makes the Martians a little bit more intimidating in the kind of off-camera kind of thing that's going on with them.
Certainly a valid artistic choice on his part.
Right. So I appreciated that. And so the story goes that there's a manned mission to Mars, and 20 years later, it takes 20 years before we go back there. And between that time, we've had World War III, right? And we have consolidation of political power with Europe and the United States into one, which there was another science fiction novel we read. Oh, The Simulacra. The most recent episode of Dickheads that we've just recorded, where the exact same thing happens in the Simulacra. So I think a lot of people were thinking that there must be some kind of sci-fi zeitgeist at the time that people are thinking about the idea of Europe and the U.S. combining into one kind of block, which isn't that hard to believe with NATO.
And in Heinlein, it goes back to what I think is, despite my problem with its politics as well, my favorite piece of writing of his, the 1940 short story Solution Unsatisfactory, in which he basically comes right out and says that the only way humankind can survive the invention of nuclear weapons is via a world government led by a benevolent dictator.
Yeah. Yikes. Well, and, that's one of...
And the reason he calls it Solution Unsatisfactory is at the very end he reveals that even the benevolent dictator himself is unhappy about that.
Right. Well, okay, so you got this idea of he has all these weird concepts of political power that are kind of glossed over here in Stranger Things. They're in the background. They're the world building, which I'm fine with, right? But they are pretty heavy-handed if you really think about it. Even though they go by really quickly, there's a lot of really heavy ideas about World War III that are kind of peppered in there and really good world building. So I would say, as far as artistic choices, I think the world building is done really well in the first part of the book. I don't know. Do you agree with me on that, on the world building?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And so early on, and this might be the difference between the two versions that we read, because for me, those parts go really quickly in the 1969 version that I read. And so the Mars mission happens, and the second mission happens, and they go back, and the first astronauts, they died. See, Larry, I need you to do story recap here, because I'm not used to doing this. So they died on Mars, and they send another mission, and lo and behold...
And Heinlein's misogyny comes out because the first mission is gender mixed, and the second mission is all male. And he seems to be attributing the failure of the first mission to the gender mixing.
Right, because we wanted to send couples because we thought that would work out better, but something went wrong. Right, and but one thing that he had to have gender mixing there for the plot, right? So because plot.
And he puts in that Valentine Michael Smith is the result of an adulterous relationship between two of the people, between a man and a woman on the original crew, other than the ones they were married to.
Right. And so we don't know much about how they found him, where they found him, all that stuff. Again, I like that. But they bring him back to Earth. And so that begins the kind of fish out of water part of the novel, which I liked that part. And I liked, because basically Michael Valentine comes back and to Earth, and he has to learn language. He has to learn what people are, and he knows a little bit because he has Martian customs and those things that, are so alien that, like the whole water bonding and all that stuff, which makes sense because Mars is a planet. It's not going to have a shit ton of water. So water is going to be really important to their spirituality. Probably.
One of my favorite scenes is the one where Jill wants to give him a bath, and he's shocked that she actually wants him to get into this huge tub of water that she's filled for him.
Right. And that was a great world building moment. But here's the thing about this part of the book. I found myself during this part thinking, and I'm not sure I held this up the whole way, but there was one movie that I kept thinking about during that first half and saying, ooh, this is going to be sacrilege, and a lot of people are going to be like, what? But I almost felt in the first half that Starman, the John Carpenter movie, was a better version of this part of the story. I grew up on Starman, so I could be partial to it for that reason. But I didn't read Stranger in a Strange Land. The first time I read Stranger in a Strange Land was when I was in college, like 25 years ago. I don't think I was grown up enough to get some of the things that were being presented in this book. But I can tell you that was my reaction the first time was, oh, this is like a lame version of Starman. Have you ever seen the John Carpenter movie Starman?
No, although I've seen enough Carpenter movies that he's on my list of favorite directors, and I've raised a lot of eyebrows by saying that in the 1991 film They Live, John Carpenter did The Matrix and got more out of that plot premise than the Wachowskis could do in 3 longer movies.
Well, I'm going to agree with you on that, except for I'm going to nerd check you and say that They Live came out much earlier than 1991. It was, I believe, 86 or 87. But
okay, I think 91 might have been when I saw it, but
right. Well, it's okay. I'm nerd checking you because and
I also like his version of The Thing better than the original.
Well, I think that's not even a debate. It's definitely the better version. But if you've never seen... Now, Starman is an important movie for John Carpenter because it's the only time one of his actors got nominated for Best Actor. And it was Jeff Bridges playing basically the Michael Valentine Smith role in that movie. Now, Starman is more of a romantic comedy, right? It doesn't have quite Well, it does have social commentary. And it's funny because I almost sent you an email a couple days ago saying you should watch Starman before we do this episode. But because I knew I was going to bring it up.
And Stranger in a Strange Land could certainly have had a romantic comedy aspect
to it.
If, Heinlein hadn't wanted to get on his polyamory soapbox and had made Michael and Jill a more conventional romantic couple.
Right. And so Starman does have... Starman is a movie about an alien that comes to Earth, and he has 3 days on the planet, and he has to go, basically... He gets picked up in Arizona, so he goes on this road trip, basically, with Karen Allen, who from Raiders of the Lost Ark is the lead actor. And along the way, we get to the fish out of water, stranger in a strange land thing. In a lot of ways, this first half of the book, I just kept thinking, man, Starman just nailed this. And I certainly think that there would have been an argument for people when they saw Starman to say, this is just Stranger in a Strange Land, kind of condensed and kind of thing. It doesn't have the polyamory or any of that stuff. But it does have a little bit of social commentary. But so for anybody out there who's listening, if you've never seen Starman, I highly recommend Starman. It is, I think, an underrated film in Carpenter's filmography. And it was an early studio film for him. And and Jeff Bridges is amazing as the alien in it, and was nominated for him and Sigourney Weaver being nominated for Ripley. It's one of the few times a science fiction actor got nominated for the big cheese. In that case. But anyway, so the first part of this book just reminded me a lot of Starman. And then once Michael Valentine Smith starts to grok human language, right? And then it kind of shifts. We have this whole kind of escape part of the storyline where Jill helps him escape from the hospital where he's being taken, which was kind of a ridiculous scene, but whatever. And then once Michael Valentine's out, you get more of you start getting the other characters kind of involved in learning the Martian language and that whole kind of thing. I'm probably glossing over a lot of this. But I think the important thing is in the second half of the book, the storyline turns to this whole thing of where he goes from being the fish out of water, stranger in a strange land kind of thing, to being assured of himself and his position by teaching the Martian language to other people. He starts to influence culture, and it becomes this whole other thing. The whole Jungle Book thing is totally gone, because at this point he's influencing human culture so much that they're starting their own religions, those kinds of things. That's when we find out that the Martians blew up a fifth planet. That was interesting. Part of the storyline. And then in the end, I'm just going to shoot ahead. Michael dies.
Mm-hmm.
We have this whole...
Michael is essentially crucified like Jesus Christ or Joseph Smith.
Right.
And almost seems like he wills that because he's seen that martyrdom is a great way to found your religion.
Right. And
also because Martians don't really die.
Right. And they feed parts of themselves to people, and then they live on in some kind of psychic reverberation. Am I remembering?
The old ones, that they're basically just pure energy at that point.
Right.
That they can still communicate with the living and, talk to them and give them directions, but they are simply no longer corporeal, which is why, Michael uses the word discorporate instead of die.
Right.
And there's marvelous, one of those marvelous little bits in the book where, as part of his voluminous reading of everything published on Earth to learn our culture, he reads Romeo and Juliet and he has a sense of joy that Romeo discorporates. Right. And then he reads on and realizes it's supposed to be a tragedy because Romeo discorporated too soon.
Right. Well, and here's the thing. I like the whole... everything with the Martian culture and the old ones I found very interesting. Everything with the humans in this book I found annoying as shit. Right? Because the humans, whenever Heinlein's writing humans in this book, I find them distasteful, and I don't find the ideas presented to be interesting, because I think it's what you said before. It's a lot of Heinlein on his soapbox about polyamory, and, I don't know if he was trying to get Virginia to start swinging or whatever, and
Yeah, I know. I had that feeling as well. It's like, a book that so, blatantly advertises for, multi-partner sexuality. What was his relationship like?
Right. And was he, what was it? Look, and I, not to judge, because, if that's your thing,
And did
fine.
Virginia go along with this, or did she say, honey, save it for your books?
Right. Keep it in the pages. Keep it in the pages, Bob. Well, and so here's the thing. I really like the science fictional aspects of this book. On each end, and there's the beginning and the end. I like all of that. I like all those elements, but I think overall, all the times that he's on his soapbox and all the human characters, and if you get down, if I have in my notes, I have a list of all the characters, right? So, we've got Michael Valentine, we got Jill Boardman, Bill Caxton, Jubal, right, who we know is like the big stand-in. He's the writer and lawyer guy, right?
Yeah.
And he's the big stand-in for Heinlein. You have Anne, Duke, Larry, go through all these names, Joseph Douglas, Alice Douglas. You have the Fosterites, you have that weird religion that's kind of like this post-World War III religion, right? Mm-hmm. You have all these people, all these humans, they all suck. They're all terrible characters to me. None of them, they're all cardboard. Michael Valentine is an interesting character, but mostly because of the setting and where he comes from. But he, too, once he gets, we're going to share water, he's pretty self-important, indulgent fucking dude anyways, because, why does he think so highly of himself that he wants to start a religion? That makes me curious about that guy. So, in the end, all the characters are, kind of unappealing to me. And I like a lot of the ideas, but I think overall, I mostly was not digging this book. I'm glad I read it. I'm glad, that this was something that I experienced beyond the fact that it was a part of the series. But, it's with most of the Dick books, there's just so many cool ideas and things that carry me on, even if the characters aren't the best all the time and have names like Ragglegum and shit like that. Time out of chewing. But just something wasn't hooking with me. Now, I don't we can start to get into overall feelings, how did this story work for you, Mark, as the first time reading it?
Well, a friend of mine had told me a few years ago that he thought that the first half of Stranger in a Strange Land was absolutely beautiful and the second half was just silly. And okay. I suspect where it got silly for him was where it got silly for me, which is when Michael and Jill leave Jubal's compound and go off on their road trip and end up performing in a circus. And
that is some fucking wacky shit right there.
Yeah. It's, kind of ironic that, Heinlein's going for this irony of, they're presenting themselves as stage magicians and they're really magic.
Right.
Yeah, Michael is really levitating Jill and everybody thinks, oh, it's just an illusion. Thurston did this. That was clever.
No, and what's the logic there? So he hangs out for 20 years with these non-corporeal beings, so they teach him how to do all this stuff? Is that... I never really got a full understanding of... Because he shared water with them?
Going back to the ending, where Heinlein says that actually he's not an Earthling at all. He's really a Martian in Earth form, as are Foster and Digby from the Fosterite cult.
Right.
And that they're, the advance guard of a Martian invasion, spying on Earth and collecting information to see whether the Martians should let us live or destroy Planet 3 the way they destroyed Planet 5.
Yeah, and they destroyed it pretty good because they turned it into an asteroid belt. Which, forget the science of that for a minute because it's the wackadoo 60s sci-fi. I'll go with it.
I have never been one to judge science fiction by its science.
Right.
As long as it's vaguely plausible, I don't, it doesn't really bother me if, this is really impossible.
Well, I thought it was funny that a lot of writers. Heinlein wasn't the first one to say, like, I bet the asteroid belt was a planet that got blown up, and that science doesn't work.
There were serious astronomers at one point who did believe that. So.
Right, but there were serious astronomers who thought lots of weird and wacky shit in the past. Andromeda or the Andromeda Galaxy. I don't know how many different things people thought it was before they realized it was another galaxy, but I'm nerd digressing. And anyways, yeah, I think those wacky parts where it got silly with the circus and the magic thing and the telekinesis is like, I think if he had kind of dialed some of that back, it might have worked for me a little bit better too. But I wouldn't just say that the beginning is really beautiful, and I'd just say I think the majority of the middle is where I think there are cool elements towards the end. Although, truth be told, I'm going to out myself here. The ending was so fuzzy in my head that I went back and reread the Wikipedia summary of the plot before we started recording just to make sure I remembered it correctly in the end, because towards the end I was really ready for this book to be over.
I think that's a major problem with it, that it's the kind of trick ending that O. Henry could make work in a short story, but a 525-page novel, you want it to end in a way that's consistent with everything that's gone before, not have the writer tap you in the shoulder saying, oh, I've just been kidding you for 524 pages. The Martians are really SOBs.
Right. Yeah. They've been hiding here all along, and they've just been looking out for us. And so I guess we get the idea that Michael Valentine creating this religion is partially what saves us from the Martians. And, I guess that's kind of interesting, but I liked your thoughts where you're saying you could see a version where there's a Starship Troopers response to, like, we've got to organize against Mars. You could definitely see that. But, it's interesting. I will say that for many years, Heinlein, this was considered his classic and whatever. He didn't milk it with a sequel or do any of that, which he probably really easily could have done. And I'm surprised he never did. But
well, maybe he felt the way Margaret Mitchell did when she was asked to do a sequel to Gone with the Wind. She said, I have nothing more to say about those people.
Yeah. Well, he probably didn't. But, the thing about this book is that it was really hard for me, and maybe because I don't forgive Robert Heinlein for any of his ideas, but it was really hard for me to ignore the hypocrisy and the things that I saw in the way Heinlein presented a lot of these ideas. Like, it's free love, but, two men together, now that's gross, and there's definitely lines in there where
it's hard to believe that you could have a polyamorous cult that was exclusively heterosexual.
Exactly.
And it's nice to hear that someone who isn't gay was as bothered by that aspect of the book as I was.
Well, yeah, no, that I couldn't ignore that, and I couldn't ignore the line the line in there about rape and those things in there. This really bothered me.
Although he does also say that once you become adept in Michael's religion and the Martian culture, a woman who is genuinely sexually assaulted can simply make the assaulter disappear.
Right. And which, hey, I'm all for making them disappear. However, that doesn't make it like, oh, it's no big deal, right? And I think that's kind of somewhat of the attitude that was presented there. There's lots of really cringy moments in this book.
Yeah, before we go on that one of the things that I noted was that in a lot of ways the book's sexual attitudes are very much out of date.
Yeah.
That, this was a book that, as I was saying earlier, was seized on by the hippies as, what they were aiming for, a world where anybody could have sex with anybody else and nobody considered it a big deal. Which made me wonder, how did they avoid unwanted pregnancies or STDs, which Heinlein explains towards the end by saying, oh, well, once they learn the Martian discipline, they can just wish all that stuff away.
Right.
And
which is really nice and sounds really great, but it's very unrealistic and dangerous.
It's not how the real world works.
Yeah, it's a dangerous idea too.
I would hope I would hope that the real life version of the Church of All Worlds at least makes condoms available to its members.
Well, maybe there's an AIDS era sequel to Stranger in a Strange Land.
If you ever get in touch with Norman Spinrad, you can ask him to write it.
Right, exactly. Well, and God, and so that was just the thing that was so hard for me. So let's look at the books that were also nominated in this year.
I still want to stay on that topic for a moment.
Okay, because, go ahead.
In a large part, the whole second wave feminist movement was not only a reaction to the roles women had been forced into by the mainstream culture, but also the way women were treated in the hippie culture. The fact that they were expected to have sex with any man who asked them, that it was considered, quote, uncool, unquote, which was the ultimate insult in the hippie world, for a woman to say no to a man. And, since then, the whole thing has swung the other way. It's occurred to me that in the 1970s, you had the so-called human potential movement. You had people saying, people need to drop their defenses and just hug each other more. And that, and now people are horrified by that. And, you've got the Me Too movement saying, people's personal spaces need to be protected. And I have this fear that we're going in the other way, and everybody's just getting very closed in and very fearful of any kind of contact, even verbal cues that, men are reporting that, they feel scared to compliment a woman on her appearance because she'll accuse them of sexually harassing her just by making that comment. And, it's like, this novel reflects someone who went way overboard in one direction of that of, everybody ought to be available to everybody else. And now we're going whole hog in the other direction. And even people who consider themselves politically progressive are adopting this very, anti-sexual attitude that takes, needed protections that women should have, from being harassed in the workplace, being, being made to be afraid of rape, and just is going off in this other direction of a kind of neo-Puritanism. Mm-hmm. So it's a very odd book to read in the current social climate, which is really moving away from the ideas that Heinlein was advancing that became quite popular later in the 60s.
Well, and I think that's going to be the most interesting thing to take away from reading Stranger in a Strange Land in 2019, because here's the thing. We both read it this year, right? And it was you for the first time, and me essentially for the first time, because I think I read it when I was too young to really understand what I was reading. So I had read it before, but basically I read it for the first time in 2019. So we can't read this in the context. We can try to think about how it would have been read in the 60s, right? We can think about that. But we're reading it now. So we are reading it in the context of this, and I think... I think that's why we always try to do the thing of trying to remind people what happened in the year that this was written, because I do think it's important to think about the context in which, and I will give some leeway to a book, but then there's a degree that, I'll give leeway to Lovecraft, for example, on certain things, but at the same time, when he uses the N-word to name his cat, it's like, no, dude, I can't, I'm not going to totally ignore that, right? And there's a lot of things in Stranger in the Strange Land that I just, don't feel like I want to ignore, because if I'm thinking about it now, it just doesn't hold up in a lot of ways. And and that's the thing, is that we look at certain books, for example, take Man in the High Castle, which won the award the next year, right? The won the Hugo the next year. That book holds up, right? There's nothing in it that's cringy for me. I mean, well, there's a little bit, maybe a little bit of the Japanese stuff, but for the most part, it holds up. And in a lot of ways, even though I disagree with Starship Troopers, this funny thing is that there's still a lot of good stuff in how the women are portrayed in that book. And here's a book that he puts out a year later that that undoes what little positive things he did with that. So,
I mean, you mentioned Lovecraft. The nice thing about Lovecraft is that by the end of his life, he had grown out of a lot of the racism that is bothersome in his earlier works. That that in his very last story, the Italians of Federal Hill, whom he had hated for years, emerge on the side of good.
Yeah, I know he came around a lot of that, but I'm not sure the Heinlein did. But I'm not a Heinlein expert. I'm a Dick expert, so I'll stick with Dick, right, on that, and then
I'll stick with Dick, says a straight man to a gay man.
Right. Well, listen, we got to do the Dick puns all the time on this podcast. I'll stick with Brunner as well. Here's a guy now. Look, and a couple of years later, Stand on Zanzibar comes out, and John Brunner nails so much of our future in that book. It's scary, and there's a little bit of cringy stuff in there, but for the most part, man, that book really holds up. And you're talking about Stand on Zanzibar, you got a book that in 1969 nails mass shootings in America. What a random thing to predict perfectly. Right? And so it's funny because you look at this book and there's a lot of really cool science fictional ideas, but there's there's nothing like that here too that I feel like Heinlein super nailed. Even the way the free love movement happened a couple years later, yeah, maybe he got some of that right, but that stuff's not even really valid or kind of the way people think anymore. I mean, the free love happens in different ways in this day and age with swipe left, swipe right on phone screens. And so you got all kinds of weird things with that. But I don't know. Any other thoughts on the political stuff in this book? I
guess I'm a little disappointed that you read the shorter version and had some of the same criticisms that I had of the longer version. That
they were still
there.
I
was hoping that he had cut that down to the bone in the editing process.
Well, he may have cut it down to the bone, but it's still there.
He still gets on his soapbox a lot.
Yeah, and look, I've got plenty of dog-eared pages where he's talking about a lot of that stuff, and there was one time when I was looking to edit this out, and I was going to pull out some of those quotes, and I was going to do that, but I don't know. I don't know. I almost think that this book doesn't deserve that level of scrutiny to a degree. I mean, I think it's good to talk about it and think about the issues. And yes, whether I consider it, look, I'm, me personally, I'm only going to give this book 3 corporeal old ones out of 5, right? Non-corporeal old ones out of 5. I know it's a masterpiece, considered one. And I think it is valid as a masterwork of science fiction that it, 60 years later, it doesn't hold up super well for me. But I understand its position in the genre. And I'm going to give it that respect. And that's why it got 3 out of 5 for me, because otherwise I probably would have given it 2.
Because I looked up Heinlein's Wikipedia page and saw the author was saying, that Heinlein was one of the 3 greatest science fiction writers of the 20th century, along with Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke. And of course, my first reaction to that was, weren't there a couple guys in there named Bradbury and Vonnegut who deserve at least that degree of recognition?
Yeah, I don't even know if you could say. I don't even know if you could nail it down to 3. And I would argue that Ursula Le Guin's better than them, and since they say
instead
of just naming 3 white dudes, but
and I couldn't help. In some ways, I couldn't help but think of Stranger in a Strange Land and mentally compare it to Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles, which I had also recently reread. And
interesting, because I haven't read that.
Because I think in a way, Bradbury is to Heinlein what F. Scott Fitzgerald was to Ernest Hemingway. That Fitzgerald and Bradbury both had this knack of being able to write prose that hovered on the thin edge of poetry, and that's what I love about both of them.
Mm-hmm.
And, Heinlein, like Hemingway, was, a ragbag of certain prejudices. An English teacher I had in junior college said that Hemingway lived life from the waist down. And,
Right.
I think one could make that case for Heinlein as well. Certainly the Heinlein of this book. And,
he was definitely.
He has a very good, strong, clear writing style, but also he just gets into so many thickets of his own social and political prejudices. And,
And
there were a lot of parts where I thought, get off the soapbox and get on with the story.
Yeah.
And he is also not really an attentive world builder. I know, that there were reasons he decided to make the Martians as shady as they are, but, he does not give us Valentine Michael Smith's big sermon.
Mm-hmm.
He does not give us any more than one word of the Martian language.
That's true.
Which, I compared to J.R.R. Tolkien's elaborate working out of languages for his alien creatures, because he really wanted to make sure, even if it didn't end up that much in the books, that he knew how the alien races talk to each other.
Which is kind of a stupid thing that, he's really obsessed with using this one Martian word.
Yeah.
But none of the other Martian words. Like, he's got to say grok, all the time.
Which in the context simply means understand.
Right.
And
yeah.
And he's saying that Martian has a whole different value system and a whole different thought pattern built into it, but he doesn't have enough confidence in himself as a writer to put that down on paper.
Right. So I guess, there were world-building things that I did like, but you know what? You're right. You're right, Mark. The world-building is shit here, isn't it? Comparatively, Well, I mean, for a guy who's really... And his world-building in Starship Troopers was great. But it was easier stuff to do because it was just like a space opera. It was just like, he was telling a submarine or a infantry story set in science fiction. So that's easier to do than invent a whole culture and all that. So I guess you could say on a science fiction level that he was being pretty lazy about that. So let's look at the books he was up against. Wait, did you want to give your rating first?
I don't know. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms, because it's hard to separate its historical importance from how it comes off now. Mm-hmm. And as I said earlier, some of the social attitudes that were considered very avant-garde and risky then have become severely dated.
Right. Well, and I think that's why, I gave it a bonus star for its classic status, but, honestly, if I'm being honest, it's a 2-star book for me. Really.
Okay.
But really, I'm going to give it another star because I know it's important to the genre. Now, why did it win the Hugo? Well, let's see what it was up against. Dark Universe by Daniel F. And then it's spelled Galoue, Galloway
or something like that.
Yeah, you know me and names. Sense of Obligation by Harry Harrison with the alternate title Planet of the Damned. And The Fisherman, alternate title Time is the Simplest Thing by Clifford Samack. And Second Ending by James White. So the only one of these other ones that I've read is Time is the Simplest Thing by Clifford Samack. And that is not one of my favorite Samack books. But, it's not really strong competition here. I haven't heard most of these. Well, what do I know? Because I haven't read any of the other ones. But there's not one that I'm like, oh shit, that was a classic. That should have won. Yeah,
I'm familiar with Harry Harrison only from having met him in 1972, right after his novel Make Room about overpopulation was filmed at Soylent Green.
Yep.
And the one thing Harry Harrison wanted to talk about was how pissed off he was at the ending of Soylent Green. That
right.
It's not people in his book.
Right.
Sorry to disappoint you all.
Soylent Green was not people. I haven't read Make Room. I need to. I know, right around this, I think the year before, Harrison was also nominated for Death World. And Death World is really cool weird little pulpy sci-fi book. He was nominated a lot, so he was a big name there. But I mean, I think this is one like those years when you watch the Oscars and everybody knows what's going to win. Like from the beginning, I think everybody knew Stranger and Strangeland was going to win. It was the first New York Times bestseller science fiction novel. I don't know if that had happened at that point, but
and it was obviously accomplishing what Heinlein had set out for it as, the book that would establish him as a serious writer with literary credentials and not just a genre guy.
Well, because it wasn't science fiction. It was a hold on, I gotta pull up my notes. It was a social political satire of sex and religion in contemporary culture, not science fiction. So it's funny because my copy says the most famous science fiction novel ever written, right on the cover. It does not say the most famous socio-political satire of sex and religion in contemporary culture ever written. But,
I think that would have more competition than...
Right. I don't know. What's another socio-political satire of sex and religion that we can think of? Like, there's a bunch, I suppose, but...
once again, you could go back to Gulliver's Travels on that.
True. You could go back to that. Yeah, so as far as the Hugo winner goes, yeah, its place is cemented in history, and it's an important book, and yada yada yada. But at the same time, like, fuck, man, I had a hard time finishing this one. I wasn't super into it, but then again, at the end, it kind of redeemed itself because I did like the ending. It was more of a short story ending. It was a ha-ha, like, look at that. He martyred himself, But at the same time, I am glad I read it overall. Overall, I'm glad I read it. And I think it's important for this series that we really... I think we're putting context to the era of which, Philip K. Dick was doing his most important work, like what the state of the art was in science fiction. And especially if you figure it... And that's the thing is, like, we just recorded recently, I don't know the order these are going to come out in, but the 1965 winner, The Wanderers by Fritz Leiber, which was hot dog shit. And, that book was terrible. And when you consider that, you've got Stranger in a Strange Land, Starship Troopers, Man in the High Castle, back-to-back, Way Station, Clifford Samac, which somehow beat Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. Not to talk shit on Samac, I love Clifford Samac. I think City is one of the best science fiction novels of the 50s. But at the same time, like, there's some really good shit here in the early part of the 60s, and then how the fucking Wanderer by Fritz Leiber won, I'll never know. But this one I can understand why it won. So, any final thoughts on Stranger in a Strange Land here?
I think we've pretty much dissected the corpse after the discorporation.
Right. Are you going to read more Heinlein novels? I mean, I have to read Moon is a Heart's Mistress for this podcast, but
I picked that one up at the same time, and it would be interesting. Apparently, that goes even more into his politics. Although,
no, that's supposed to be the libertarian with a capital giant fucking L on it.
I mean, certainly, the Heinlein and Ayn Rand have that one thing in common, that they both were quite clear that if two adults wanted to have sex with each other, it was nobody else's business, not the governments, not religions, and not anybody else they might be married to.
Which was a big fucking deal at the time, right? That 1961, that's a big deal. For this, that's how many years? That's like 8 years before Stonewall, right?
And Stranger in a Strange Land was published 4 years after Atlas Shrugged.
Right. For better or for worse.
For better or for worse. Yeah. Which, I must say I have a great affection for Ayn Rand's novels because they are such beautiful bad books. They're so, reading them is like watching an Ed Wood movie, or at least what an Ed Wood movie would have been if he'd had an enormous budget.
Well, here's the problem. An Ed Wood movie only takes 2 hours. Reading an Ayn Rand novel takes fucking long time. So that's my problem. The difference. I'll watch a bad movie and crack up, but it's really hard with bad books.
Well, she had me glued to the page just because it was so outrageous, and I'm thinking, my God, there are so many people out there who take this shit seriously.
Well, let me tell you, Mark, as somebody who writes book reviews for my blog of different horror books, I get horror books in the mail from random self-published authors. And I one time got a Vampire Hunter from Nova Scotia novel. It was a cowboy, samurai, Vampire Hunter from Nova Scotia novel. And let me tell you, that would make a fucking hilarious movie. But when you get to sit down and read 300 pages of it, that's how I feel about Anne Rind, or reading those books. Like, I just can't devote that much time to fucking garbage. Unless I have a podcast to do about it. But don't anyone challenge us to that. It will not happen. That one I will put my fucking foot down. I will not do that. All right, so...
we could do one on Anthem, which is relatively short, and which he said was the best capsule version of her philosophy.
Oh, fuck, Mark, no! No! This is not... What would be the Anne Rind podcast? Rinders? Anne Rinders? I don't know. Fuck. No, not doing it. Not doing it.
It was... Yeah, her name was pronounced Ayn Rand, but I'll take Rind as your critical comment on her.
Well, sure. God, no! Not doing that podcast. Not doing that. And sorry, no... It would be funny because our listeners are pretty silent, don't make a lot of comments. And it'd be funny if this is the fucking thing that gets everybody out there. Yeah, do that fucking podcast. No. Ain't happening. Not happening. All right. I don't know what's up next in the Hugo series because we're recording them out of order. So I have no idea what to tell you to look forward to. But if you made it this far in Stranger in a Strange Land, thanks for listening. And we'll be doing one more Heinleiners with Moon is a Harsh Mistress. And since I know Mark got a copy of it, I'm sure he'll be back for it. So thanks a lot for listening. Keep it paranoid. Stay paranoid.